I'm joined now by the Minister for Housing and the Assistant Treasurer, Michael Sukkar. Michael Sukkar, welcome.
Patricia, good to be with you.
There's a 6-month moratorium on residential and commercial evictions. I just want you to put your Housing Minister hat on. Does that mean people can stop paying rent if there's a moratorium?
Well, the short answer to your question, Patricia, is of course not. There is a moratorium on evictions, but there's not a moratorium on the requirement to pay rents. Now, I think it's useful to separate commercial and, of course, the residential piece here. But from a commercial perspective, I know that our National Cabinet will have more to say further to their principles that were outlined last week on how particularly states and territories are going to deal with it. I mean, as the Prime Minister has said, we need landlords and tenants to come together and there must be an element of sharing the pain. Not one group or another can share it. In the residential space, in relation to the moratorium, yes, there's a moratorium because we are in extraordinary economic circumstances and the National Cabinet and the Prime Minister and all the Premiers and Chief Ministers don't want to see people evicted, but that does not absolve people of their responsibility to pay their rent. So unless you've got an arrangement with your landlord that takes into account your financial circumstances, you are required to pay your rent. And of course the moratorium applies to make sure that people don't find themselves without a home. But importantly, what the government has done is really strengthened the safety net, whether it's through the coronavirus supplement or whether through our $750 payments, 2 of which will be made, or indeed the Jobseeker payment. We've strengthened the safety net to ensure that people are able to meet the essential costs of day-to-day life. You've
told tenants and landlords to sit down and sort it out, but some tenants have a lot more bargaining power than others. What happens if they can't agree?
Well, I don't think, Patricia, it's true to say we've just told them to sit down and sort it out. We've asked them at first instance that they should do that, but there's no doubt that the National Cabinet, which will be considering proposals that I understand that will be put in front of them on Friday, will consider a framework that, yes, that's a part of it. To the greatest extent possible, we want flexibility, we want landlords and tenants to the extent they can working this out for themselves, but there will be, I'm sure, a framework of minimum standards and requirements. And let's be frank, Patricia, it's not in any landlord's interests to lose a great tenant who is going through a short-term difficulty. I'm sure they recognise that. So we are seeing a lot of landlords and tenants working closely together, but we need to put in some minimum standards, and that's what I'm confident the National Cabinet will do. I'm obviously not a member of that National Cabinet, but I know that's what they will certainly consider. I'm interested to know
what the framework might consider. Will it consider things like whether tenants will still face eviction for other reasons and who would determine whether an eviction was justified or not? Because I've got to say, you know, I host another show, RN Drive, and on that show I was inundated with messages from actually landlords saying, what happens when you have a tenant that's not doing the right thing in your property? If there's a moratorium on evictions, will we still be able to execute some rights if the property's not being looked after or there are other issues?
Well, look, I don't want to speculate too much on what the National Cabinet will consider, but I think you can look at Tasmania's response today. I mean, in relation to their moratorium on evictions, they have obviously got carve-outs for where there's damage to the property or illegal conduct being undertaken from the property as being exceptions to that moratorium. Now, I'm not going to foreshadow what the National Cabinet might ultimately decide, but you're right, there's a very delicate balance here between landlords and tenants, and we've got to make sure we strike that balance, and that's perhaps why the National Cabinet has considered this in some detail, issued principles. There's been a lot of work that's gone on between peak groups, but on both sides of the landlords and tenants side of the equation. So I'm pretty confident that our National Cabinet will land in a sensible spot, but in the end, I'm not a member of that body and we'll have to wait and see what comes out on Friday. But again, we are very sensitive to the concerns of both tenants and landlords with these matters.
Homelessness Australia is calling for a moratorium on all evictions. Do you think that should be considered?
Well, the moratorium that I know is being considered by a number of states and territories, as far as I understand, apply to all evictions. So that that, is going to be, again, finalised, I'm sure, quite imminently. I think we all understand that in these very difficult economic times, there is a role to be played for government in trying to mandate some of this behaviour. But let's, again, not forget, Patricia, we have strengthened our safety net in a way that Australia hasn't seen for many, many decades. Again, whether it's between the coronavirus supplement, an additional $550 a fortnight, 2 payments of $750, now the Jobkeeper payment, we are really throwing a lot of firepower to make sure that individuals and households are able to meet their essential bills. And again, to go back to residential tenancies, a moratorium on eviction is not a reason not to pay your rent.
Okay, and
if
there are people who try to exploit it not to pay their rent, what will be the vehicle for landlords to ensure that they do?
Well, Patricia, again, I suspect that the National Cabinet, in determining a framework, will take those sorts of matters into account. And of course, there's always a very small number in the scheme of things who try to game the system. But yes, no doubt, the rules have to account for those people as well. Again, though, I think the principles are very clear. We don't want people to be without a home at this very, very difficult time. But at the same time, we have to be sensitive to the financial realities for landlords who have repayments that they have to make and who rely on the income stream from those properties in order to meet those repayments. So where you tweak one aspect of the system, it does have cascading consequences throughout the system. And that's why I know the National Cabinet, the Prime Minister, all of the Premiers and Chief Ministers are considering these things in very deep detail.
Could you extend the moratorium if the economy hasn't restarted in that time frame? Is that open to you?
Well, Patricia, again, that's a question for the National Cabinet. I think, if you look at the responses from the government, the Prime Minister has taken Australians into his confidence from the beginning and said this is not a quick issue. This is likely to be a 6-month issue, but no doubt if the coronavirus pandemic, its health issues and its consequent economic issues continue, then I suspect all of those things are on the table.
Could the government compensate landlords in exchange for tenants being given rent holidays?
Look, Patricia, again, I'm not going to speculate.
But is that something open to you? I'm wondering if that's in the suite of things you're looking at.
Well, it's not for me to be offering gratuitous advice to the National Cabinet, again, made up of our Prime Minister and Premiers and Chief Ministers. They are capable of determining these things that I think to the greatest extent possible, one of the most comforting things for Australians throughout this very difficult time has been seeing our leaders, led by the Prime Minister, but our leaders nationally, working collectively, working with one voice to the greatest extent possible. And I think we would want to see that continue in this way through the National Cabinet process as well.
What about businessman Solomon Liu? Is he justified in refusing to pay rent on any of his stores?
Patricia, I'm not going to comment on individual cases between landlords and tenants. Suffice it to say that the framework that's being developed by the National Cabinet, I think, again, will be very sensitive to the needs of landlords and tenants, and also the basic principle that is that the pain has to be shared. It can't be worn by one group or another.
If someone has a series of Airbnb apartments they rent out as a source of income and they've lost that income, as they clearly have because of restrictions we have on travel, what specific help is there for them? Should there be?
Well, it depends on their own circumstances, Patricia, and investment income is dealt with in a different way. I mean, one of the broad things and questions that certainly arose throughout the process of developing the Jobkeeper policy was how far this would extend. Obviously, we've taken a very expansive approach with where the Jobkeeper $1,500 fortnight payment would go. We included part-time employees in addition to full-time employees. We've included long-term casual employees who have been employed for a period of 12 months. We've included self-employed people and sole traders. So we've taken a very expansive approach because we really want to keep people connected to their businesses We want to keep them connected to whatever it is, the trade that they are undertaking, and that's the approach we've taken. But as for specific examples, it really always depends on the particular individual, whether it's investment income, active income, whether they're running a business, whether it's passive. So that's, I think, the basic position. But we have been very, very broad in the way in which we've framed the JobKeeper payment.
There are other fees as well with property, as you know, fees like insurance and, of course, body corporate fees, the sorts of fees people pay in apartment blocks if you're an owner of those apartment blocks or you know, apartments within them. Are you also going to be looking at those issues about whether they should be waived or there should be a break or a pause on those sorts of fees as well?
Well, that's probably a better question for some of the state ministers that might be involved, because they are obviously creatures of state legislation. What I do understand, Patricia, is that through the National Cabinet process, individual states, but also the Commonwealth working cooperatively, are looking at the entire stack of costs that go into a landlord owning a property, whether that's council rates, whether, as we've spoken about, it's land tax. So I can't conceive that it's out of this world that is being considered, but again, that's not something that I have been working on. It's something that will be determined within the National Cabinet processes, which is occurring predominantly at this point with those state governments and territory governments.
When I started speaking to you, I mentioned that 430,000 businesses have now registered with the ATO for what is now called the JobKeeper payment.
Yeah.
What do you make of those figures, and what are your projections for how much further that will grow in coming days?
Well, it's gone very, very quickly, Patricia. It's literally growing by the minute, and that's a good thing. We have wanted to give people that ability to register their interest almost immediately from when the announcement was made. Treasury has estimated that this will cover the JobKeeper payment, $1,500 a fortnight, 6 million employees. So that's obviously many hundreds of thousands of businesses, but 6 million employees is what we think the coverage of this scheme will be. Time will tell. You know, Patricia, almost better than anybody, just how vexed it is making these sorts of projections, but 6 million employees is really the best estimate that Treasury has given the government.
One of the things you and I used to talk about, it seems like a million years ago, Michael Suker, is housing prices and the ability of particularly younger people to enter the housing market. Is that a problem you no longer have?
Patricia, look, we have seen some real improvements. You know, and I commend you. It's a topic that you have had an abiding interest in, and you haven't waxed or waned with it. But we have seen an improvement. Record first home buyer numbers, back over 100,000 new first home buyers each year. We obviously implemented the first home loan deposit scheme, which gave 10,000 people access to a first home with a 5% deposit. That has been extraordinarily popular. So there's no doubt that things have improved, certainly from really the peak of the property market in 2017, when things were getting really tough for first home buyers. And I might add, we also in that time put in place the First Home Super Saver scheme, again, to help accelerate people's savings to get into a home. I think time will tell on what impact the coronavirus health issue, which has obviously got significant economic dimensions, will have on house prices. But, you know, let's remember, you know, we want a healthy economy. We want people who are able to access stable employment, because if you've got a stable job, you're able to get a mortgage and you're able to purchase a home. And that's really what the government's focused on with policies like JobKeeper, strengthening the safety net, giving people that confidence to take what is a leap of faith for many people, which is to buy your first home, to sign on that dotted line and agree to be paying mortgage repayments for the next 30 years. relies on you having a great deal of confidence in your future, and what the Morrison government and through the National Cabinet is trying to do at the moment is give people as much confidence as they possibly can at a time when confidence is understandably at a low ebb.
Thank you so much for your time, Minister.
Thanks, Patricia.
And that's the Minister for Housing and the Assistant Treasurer, Michael Suker.